Daniel's life was calm, organized, and respectable in every way. He lived in a clean, quiet neighborhood on the edge of a growing town. His apartment was on the third floor of a modest building that faced a small park. Every morning, the same. Birds landed on the same tree outside his window, and every evening the same soft orange light poured through his curtains. On the surface, everything was in place: his work, his social life, his health. But deep inside, Daniel often felt like he was watching his own life from the outside. Something was missing, but he couldn't name it. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't anxiety. It was something quieter than that, more like a gentle ache, like being homesick for a place you've never actually been. Daniel worked as an assistant in a small design firm. His tasks were repetitive but manageable. He didn't hate his job. He simply didn't love it either. He got along well with his coworkers. They shared jokes during lunch breaks and sent each other birthday wishes in the office group chat. But none of these interactions ever moved past surface-level politeness. Daniel felt like he was playing a role, showing up as someone people expected him to be, and not necessarily who he truly was. The problem was he didn't even know who that true self was. He just knew he hadn't met him yet. Outside of work, Daniel's life was just as steady. He had a small circle of friends who invited him out now and then. They went to the same restaurants, had the same conversations, and laughed at the same stories. He went along, nodded, smiled, even made others laugh sometimes. But often he felt invisible, even when surrounded by people. It was as though his presence filled a seat but didn't leave a mark. He didn't blame anyone for this. His friends weren't unkind. They were just as caught up in life's flow as he was. At night, Daniel often lay awake in bed, not disturbed by noise but by a strange emptiness. He wondered if this was all life had to offer: repetition, politeness, small talk, busy streets, and a constant undercurrent of restlessness. There was no crisis, no drama, just a quiet and growing need to step away, to stop performing, to disappear, not out of sorrow, but out of curiosity. He wanted to know what remained when the noise of the world faded away. What would be left if he removed the expectations, the routine, and the labels? One morning, Daniel woke up early. The sky was still pale. He looked around his room: the neat desk, the folded clothes, the clock ticking without urgency. Everything was familiar, and yet none of it felt like it belonged to him. He stood by the window and watched the street slowly come to life. A man walked his dog. A newspaper truck passed. Somewhere, a kettle whistled in a nearby apartment. It was all ordinary, but something inside Daniel had shifted. The thought that had lived in his mind like a whisper now stood loud and clear. It was time to leave. He didn't know where he would go. He just knew he had to go somewhere where nobody knew him. Not to escape responsibility or run from pain, but to give himself a chance to see clearly, without mirrors, without masks. He packed lightly. A few shirts, a jacket, a notebook, and a worn-out novel he had never finished. He left his phone on the desk. He wrote a simple note: "I'm okay. Just need time to think. I'll come back when I understand myself better." He didn't tell anyone, not his friends, not his boss. He didn't even plan the route. He walked to the bus station and bought the next available ticket. The destination didn't matter. What mattered was the distance. As the bus pulled away, Daniel looked out the window and watched the city blur into unfamiliar shapes. He didn't feel afraid. He felt strangely calm. For the first time in a long while, there was no schedule to follow, no one to impress, no need to explain anything. He was just a man on a road, quietly slipping out of one life and into another. The bus passed through quiet towns, open fields, and winding roads. Daniel sat with his hands resting on his lap, watching the changing scenery. There was no rush. He wasn't thinking about arriving. He was simply allowing space to exist between himself and the life he had always known. In that space, something new could grow. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road, Daniel felt a sense of release, not like breaking away, but more like returning to something gentle and real. He wasn't running away from life. He was walking toward something quieter, slower, and perhaps more honest. The first step had been taken not with noise or drama, but with a quiet decision made from within, to disappear for a while, in order to discover who he really was. Daniel arrived in the village without expectations. It was a small place surrounded by hills and quiet trees. There were no tall buildings, no traffic signals, no crowds. Just a few narrow streets lined with old houses, a tiny grocery store, a post office, and a bakery that smelled of fresh bread every morning. He didn't know the name of the village until he saw it painted on a signboard near the bus stop. But even before he read it, something inside him had already decided. This would be home for now. He walked through the village slowly, carrying his bag and taking everything in. The air felt cleaner here, the kind that filled your lungs without effort. People didn't rush. Children played near stone fences. Elderly men sat on benches, speaking softly to each other. Dogs roamed freely, not as strays, but as familiar faces in a familiar place. Daniel felt invisible, but in a peaceful way. No one noticed him, and for the first time he welcomed that feeling. He was just another person passing through, and that brought him comfort. After a short walk, he found a small inn at the edge of the village. The building was simple, 2 floors, painted in faded yellow. The woman who ran it was kind and didn't ask too many questions. She showed him a modest room upstairs. The bed was low to the ground, the furniture old but clean. There was a window that opened to a view of distant hills. Daniel paid for 2 weeks in advance using the cash he had brought, then unpacked his bag and placed the few belongings on a small table. He spent the first few days just observing. He woke up with the sunrise and walked through the empty fields, listening to the sounds of birds and distant voices. He didn't carry a phone or check the time often. He sat in quiet places, the bench near the bakery, the stone wall by the or the grassy patch behind the inn. Sometimes he scribbled in his notebook, not writing anything deep, just noting what he saw: a boy running after his shadow, a woman hanging laundry. The wind smells like dry wood. There was no goal in these observations. Daniel wasn't trying to be productive. He was just allowing his mind to breathe. By the second week, he started helping around the village. The bakery, which opened at dawn, always needed extra hands. He asked if he could assist, and the owner, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, nodded, without much thought. Daniel began arriving every morning to sweep the floor, carry trays, and pack loaves into paper bags. The tasks were repetitive, but they grounded him. His hands moved with the rhythm of dough and dust. There was no performance, no job title. He was simply there, doing small things with care. The owner didn't ask Daniel where he was from or why he had come. Instead, he offered him breakfast each morning after the work was done. They sat in the back room, sipping tea and eating slices of fresh bread with butter. The silence between them was not awkward. It was filled with quiet understanding. Sometimes they shared a few words about the weather or the harvest, but most days they just sat, letting the calm fill the space. As days turned into weeks, Daniel began to feel a slow change, not dramatic, not like a revelation, but more like something settling inside him. The restlessness that once lived under. His skin began to soften. There was no rush here. No pressure to be someone, no comparisons, no noise. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to pretend. One afternoon, as he walked by the stream that ran behind the village, Daniel paused to sit on a flat rock. The water was shallow, clear, and slow-moving. He took off his shoes and let his feet rest in the water. The sun warmed his back, and the sound of leaves rustling overhead filled the silence. In that moment, he realized he hadn't thought about his old life all day. Not the job, not the apartment, not the missed calls. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was just that he had created enough space between then and now to allow his mind to rest. Living in the village also taught him to notice things more carefully. He saw how the old man across the road always watered his plants at exactly the same time every morning. He noticed how the bakery cat only came out when the ovens were running. He saw how the same pair of children played near the fountain every afternoon, laughing over the same game. He began to understand the quiet structure of the village, not through words, but through rhythm and repetition. Everything had its time, its place, and its own quiet purpose. Daniel also started journaling more regularly. Each night before bed, he wrote down thoughts, not big ideas or life plans, just simple reflections. Today I felt calm while folding napkins. I didn't feel judged when I spilled flour. I saw my reflection in the bakery window and didn't look away. These notes weren't meant for anyone else. They were a mirror, one that helped him see himself without filters. He learned to enjoy stillness. On some mornings he sat for over an hour without doing anything, no phone, no book, just sitting by the window, watching the shadows move across the floor. In the past, this would have felt like wasting time, but now it felt like listening, like hearing parts of himself he had ignored for too long. He also spent time with nature in quiet ways. He walked barefoot in the garden behind the inn. He sat under trees for long periods, doing nothing but watching leaves dance in the breeze. He noticed how the clouds moved slowly, how the air changed after rain, and how silence could sometimes speak more clearly than words. The villagers started to recognize him not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged quietly. They greeted him with small nods, offered fruit from their trees, or waved as he passed. No one asked about his past. They only saw who he was now, a gentle presence, a helping hand, a calm face. That was enough. By the end of the second month, Daniel felt different, though he wouldn't have been able to explain it. It wasn't that he had found himself in any grand way. It was more like he had peeled back a layer and found something still and steady beneath it. He began to understand that he didn't need to always be doing, fixing, or chasing something. He could simply be. And in being, there was value. He also realized something important. Disappearing doesn't always mean going far away. It means stepping out of the noise long enough to hear your own voice. It means removing yourself from the roles you've been assigned so you can understand which parts of them were ever truly yours. It's not about erasing your life, but about seeing it clearly by stepping back. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the village settled into its usual quiet, Daniel sat outside the inn with a cup of tea. The air smelled of bread and damp earth. He felt no urgency, no guilt, no pressure. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, that didn't worry him. He was exactly where he needed to be, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. The village had not changed Daniel. It had simply made space for him to return to himself. The days passed slowly, and Daniel didn't mind. He had lived in the village for several weeks now, and a quiet rhythm had settled into his life. His days were simple early mornings at the bakery, peaceful walks through fields or under trees, and evenings spent in quiet corners of the village, watching the sky change colors. He was not chasing anything, not avoiding anything. He was just letting life happen as it was, one quiet hour at a time. Something had changed within him. He didn't notice it all at once. It wasn't like a light suddenly turned on. Instead, it was more like a soft fog lifting, bit by bit, allowing him to see his thoughts clearly. Without the constant noise of conversations, notifications, deadlines, and expectations, his inner world began to speak louder. And in that silence he listened. He spent more time alone, not out of sadness, but out of comfort. He no longer felt the urge to fill silence with noise or distract himself with activity. He would sit on a wooden bench near the stream, watching the water move over small stones, or lie on the grass behind the inn, his hands behind his head, looking up at the quiet clouds. He didn't think of these moments as boring. They were invitations to pause. In these moments, memories from his past would gently surface, not in a painful way, but like quiet visitors. He would remember things he hadn't thought of in years. A childhood afternoon spent building forts out of couch cushions. A time he cried alone after a school presentation didn't go well. The way his mother used to hum in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening. These memories weren't loud. They came like distant echoes, carrying with them feelings he had once buried under routine. He began to realize that so much of his life had been shaped by things he had never fully processed, moments of praise, moments of shame, expectations that others had placed on him and ones he had placed on himself. In the silence of the village, these moments slowly came back to him, not to haunt him, but to help him understand. He was not trying to fix them. He was simply sitting with them, letting them pass through him like wind through leaves. Daniel started writing more deeply in his notebook. At first, it had been simple observations about the village, what he saw, heard, and did. But now, his entries became more personal. He wrote thoughts like, "I used to be afraid of being alone because I thought it meant something was wrong with me." Or, "I've always looked for approval without knowing why I needed it so badly." He didn't judge what he wrote. He didn't try to make it sound wise. He wrote in a plain, honest way. Writing became his mirror. Not the kind that showed how he looked, but the kind that showed how he was really feeling inside. In this process, he also discovered how much of his energy had been spent on keeping up an image. Back in the city, he had tried hard to appear competent, confident, friendly, easygoing. And while none of those things were lies, they weren't the full truth either. Sometimes he had been unsure. Sometimes he had been anxious. Sometimes he had wanted to say no, but said yes because it was easier. In the village, where no one knew his story, he felt no pressure to act a certain way. He could be quiet without it being questioned. He could smile only when he felt like it. He could just be. With time, Daniel noticed his thoughts becoming clearer. The silence around him seemed to stretch into the silence within him, making space. He began to ask himself gentle questions, not the kind that demanded answers, but the kind that opened doors. Questions like, what do I really enjoy doing when no one is watching? Which parts of my life did I choose, and which parts just happened to me? What kind of person am I when I stop trying to be impressive? Sometimes, these questions sat with him for days. He didn't rush to answer them. He let them sit in the background of his thoughts while he worked, walked, or rested. Slowly, answers began to come, not always in words, but in feelings, in moments of stillness, in sudden realizations. He realized he liked quiet mornings more than late nights. He liked helping people without needing credit. He preferred deep, one-on-one conversations to loud group gatherings. He didn't need constant excitement or achievement. What he needed was something simpler: honesty, space, presence. Daniel also learned to accept uncertainty. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how long he would stay in the village. He didn't know what he would do when he returned to the city, or if he ever would. But instead of fearing this uncertainty, he began to trust it. Life didn't have to be a clear path. It could be a series of steps, taken slowly, with attention. There was a quiet wisdom in that realization. He no longer needed a big plan to feel secure. He just needed to be aligned with himself, to know that whatever step he took next, it would come from a place of truth, not pressure. As the days grew longer and the weather warmed, Daniel began to feel lighter. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was more like layers gently falling away. The weight of expectations, the pressure to be a certain way, the noise of trying to keep up, all of it slowly faded. Sometimes he met new travelers passing through the village. They often asked him how long he had been there. "I'm not sure," he would say, smiling, "long enough to feel quiet inside." They didn't always understand, but that was okay. He wasn't looking for understanding. He had already found it in the silence. He developed small habits that brought him peace. He started every morning with a walk around the village before the sun got too warm. He carried a small flask of tea and sat by the edge of the stream, listening to the sounds of the world waking up. Birds calling, leaves moving, water flowing. These became his new clock. He spent some afternoons helping an elderly woman tend to her garden. She didn't speak much, and neither did he. They worked side by side, pulling weeds, watering plants, and placing stones to keep the soil in place. It wasn't about conversation. It was about presence, two people quietly creating something with their hands. Evenings were for reflection. Daniel would sit by the window in his room, watching the sky turn colors. He often thought about the version of himself who had left the city. That person felt far away now, not because he was unrecognizable, but because he had been searching, without knowing what he was looking for. Now, Daniel knew he had been looking for himself, but not the self made of roles and routines. Not the self defined by job titles or social media posts, the deeper self. the one who could sit in silence and feel whole, the one who didn't need to be seen to know his worth, the one who could be still and say, "I am enough." One night, as he lay in bed with the window open and the soft wind brushing against the curtains, Daniel smiled. There was no noise, no urgency, no drama, just the quiet breath of night. And in that calm he felt something deeper than happiness. He felt peace. By now, Daniel had been living in the village for many months. Time had become a soft blur, days folding gently into one another, marked not by dates or deadlines but by small changes in the air, the position of the sun, and the quiet cycles of nature. It was hard to say how long he had been there because he had stopped measuring time in the usual way. There were no calendars on his wall, no notifications, no reminders. The world no longer rushed him. He moved at the pace of the present moment. In the early stages of his stay, Daniel often questioned himself in private. He wondered if he was wasting time by stepping away from his old life. He wondered whether he was hiding or healing. But as the weeks passed, those questions softened. They stopped feeling urgent. Eventually they stopped altogether. Instead, he simply began living not out of fear or routine, but with quiet intention. One morning, while carrying a tray of bread from the bakery oven to the counter, Daniel paused and looked out the window. The village square was empty, except for an old man sweeping the ground near the well. A cat rested in a sunbeam. The bakery's bell jingled lightly in the breeze. It was a small scene, nothing special, nothing remarkable, yet something about it felt complete. Daniel realized in that quiet moment that he no longer felt like a visitor here. He belonged, not because the village had claimed him, but because he had accepted himself within it. The work he did at the bakery had become a part of his identity, but not in the way Jobs had felt before. In his previous life, work had been a badge, a way to earn respect, a role to play, a title to hold. Here, it was simpler. Work was a rhythm, a part of the day. It didn't define him. It supported him. He woke up, walked to the bakery, helped knead the dough, cleaned the counters, arranged the shelves. Each movement was familiar, grounding, real. There was satisfaction in doing something well, even when no one noticed. Daniel began to understand. A new kind of strength. It wasn't the kind that demanded attention. It didn't shout or compete. It was the strength of stillness, the kind that comes from knowing yourself quietly, from accepting the smallness of your life and recognizing the depth within it. In his old life, he had tried to be seen. Now he learned how to disappear and still feel whole. In solitude, he had grown stronger, not louder, but deeper. He no longer feared being alone. Loneliness had once felt like an enemy, something to run from. Now it felt like a companion. He realized that being alone didn't mean being abandoned. It meant being with himself without distractions. And that kind of time was precious. The relationships he formed in the village were quiet too. There were no dramatic friendships, no intense bonds, just soft connections. A nod from the grocer, a cup of tea with the gardener, a shared smile with the children who passed him on their way to school. No one asked too many questions. No one tried to define him. They accepted his presence without needing his story. One woman named Rosa often sold vegetables in the village square. She was in her 60s, with silver hair tied in a loose bun and kind eyes that always looked like they knew more than they said. Daniel often bought carrots or tomatoes from her stand. Over time, they began talking nothing deep, just comments about the weather or the qualpsa. One day, as she handed him a bunch of parsley, she said gently, "You carry peace around you. That's not common." It was the first compliment in a long time that didn't feel tied to performance. It wasn't about talent or looks or success. It was about presence. And that meant more than she probably knew. Daniel wrote about it in his notebook that evening. "Peace is not something you find," he wrote. "It's something you become. When you stop pretending." He noticed how his body had changed too. His shoulders were less tense. His breathing was slower. He stood with less effort. His face, once marked by tiredness, now felt softer in the mirror. Even the way he walked had changed, not with urgency, but with quiet awareness. He no longer rushed to get anywhere. Every step mattered now. Every path led somewhere. Even if that somewhere wasn't important, there was a bench at the edge of the village that Daniel often visited. It overlooked a wide field, golden in the late afternoons. He liked sitting there after work, sipping tea from a small flask. Sometimes he watched the birds, sometimes the clouds, sometimes nothing at all. He didn't need to be entertained. He had learned to sit with silence and let it speak. One afternoon, a traveler passed by and sat beside him. They exchanged a polite hello. The man asked where Daniel was from. "Somewhere far?" Daniel said with a smile. "But I'm here now." The traveler nodded, then asked what he did. Daniel replied simply, "I help at the bakery." The traveler was quiet for a moment, then said, "You seem calm?" "Like someone who's figured it out." Daniel shook his head gently. "Not figured out," he said. "Just finally listening." That conversation stayed with him. He realized that strength wasn't always about knowing. It was about being open to not knowing. It was about allowing space for life to unfold without trying to control every detail. That kind of strength couldn't be built through books or speeches or strategies. It came from silence, from facing yourself without distraction. Daniel also began to notice how little he needed. His room at the inn remained simple: a bed, a desk, a small lamp, a chair. He had a few clothes, his notebook, and a few well-worn books. Yet he never felt deprived. He no longer craved things. He had food, rest, work, and space. And more importantly, he had clarity. In the quiet, he had come to understand that joy wasn't about having more. It was about needing less. There were no trophies on his shelves, no applause, no followers. But he had earned something else: self-trust. He trusted his own rhythm. He knew when to rest, when to move, when to speak, and when to listen. He no longer needed approval. He no longer shaped his life around how it looked to others. He shaped it around how it felt to him. Some evenings, Daniel would light a small candle by the window and just sit. He didn't try to meditate. He didn't follow any practice. He just sat, breathing, watching the flame, being alive, gently. These were his moments of strength. Quiet, steady, honest. As the seasons began to shift, Daniel noticed how the light changed in the mornings. The shadows were longer, the wind cooler. Life in the village moved with the seasons, not against them. That was another lesson he had learned. Strength doesn't always mean pushing through. Sometimes it means adapting, slowing down, listening. Nature doesn't rush, and neither should we. Daniel remembered how, in his old life, he had pushed himself to meet expectations, his own and others. There had always been a sense of not enough, not doing enough, not achieving enough, not being enough. But now, in this small village with no audience and no scoreboard, he finally felt full. Not because he had changed everything, but because he had stopped chasing things that never truly mattered to him. He had disappeared not from the world, but from the version of himself that was shaped by noise. And in that disappearance he had discovered a deeper presence, a quieter voice, a steady ground. Daniel knew he wouldn't stay in the village forever. One day he would move on. But he also knew that wherever he went next, he would carry this strength with him, not loud or visible, but rooted. He no longer needed to prove his worth. He had sat with silence and found something unshakable within himself, and that, he realized, was the kind of strength he had been looking for all along. One early morning, as Daniel sat on his usual bench at the edge of the village, a light mist drifted across the golden fields. The wind was cooler than it had been the day before. It carried the scent of earth, drying leaves, and the distant sound of a crow calling from a tall tree. He sipped from his flask of tea, watching how the sky shifted slowly from soft blue to the pale color of morning. Everything around him was still, calm, familiar. But something inside Daniel had begun to shift again, not with urgency, not with restlessness, but with quiet readiness. He had been in the village for many months now. His days were steady, his routines simple. His thoughts no longer circled endlessly in confusion. He had found space within himself. Space to breathe, space to understand, space to simply be. But now, a new sense of movement was rising inside him, not to escape, not to search, but to return. To re-enter the world, not as the man who had once left it, but as the man who had quietly come back to himself. That day, Daniel returned to his room at the inn and sat by the window for a long while. The view was the same as always: small houses, slow skies, the familiar corner of the bakery roof just below the hills, but the decision had already taken root within him. He would go back to the city, not because he missed it, but because he now felt strong enough to face it on his own terms. He spent the next few days slowly preparing for his departure. There wasn't much to pack: his notebook, a few clothes, a scarf Rosa had gifted him from the village market, and 2 books he had read over and over. He folded everything with care and placed it in the same bag he had arrived with. It felt lighter now, not just because it had less in it, but because Daniel himself carried less weight inside. He visited the people he had quietly grown to care for. At the bakery, he shared one last breakfast with the owner, just tea, bread, and a few peaceful moments in the back room. No grand goodbyes were spoken, just a soft handshake and a quiet nod. With Rosa, he stood at her vegetable stand and thanked her gently. She didn't ask why he was leaving. She just pressed a few dried herbs into his hand and said, "You'll know what to do," and she was right. Daniel didn't have a plan, but he had something more important: clarity. He didn't need all the answers. He just needed to keep living from the stillness he had discovered. And so, on a calm morning, he boarded the early bus out of the village. The road curved gently away from the hills, and Daniel looked back one last time, not with sadness, but with gratitude. This place had not changed him. It had allowed him to return to what was already within him. As the city came into view many hours later, Daniel noticed how the noise returned: not just the sound of traffic and crowds, but the inner noise too. Thoughts began to stir again. Old habits poked at the edge of his mind. But this time, something was different. He didn't feel overwhelmed. The silence he had cultivated within himself didn't vanish. It came with him. Like an inner room he could return to whenever the outside became too loud. He walked through familiar streets. The buildings stood tall. People moved quickly. Cars passed. Conversations rose and fell. Yet Daniel didn't feel out of place. He walked slowly, gently, without trying to keep up. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't trying to catch up to the life he had left. He was simply present. He returned to his old apartment building. The room was still there, just as he had left it. A neighbor greeted him in the hallway with surprise. Daniel smiled and said hello, then stepped into the quiet of his space. Dust had settled on the surfaces. The clock on the wall still ticked with steady rhythm. The books were still, lined on the shelves. But Daniel was not the same man who had once lived among these things. He opened the windows wide, letting fresh air move through the room. He didn't rush to unpack. He didn't rush to reconnect. Instead, he sat down, looked around, and allowed himself to arrive. This, too, was a part of the journey, returning with a different kind of awareness. Over the next few weeks, Daniel reintegrated into his old environment, but on his own terms. He didn't go back to his previous job. Instead, he found part-time work at a small community center, helping organize events, gardening days, and book readings. The pace was slower, the tasks more personal, and it allowed him the space to continue living in the quiet way he had come to cherish. His friends were surprised to see him again. Some asked where he had gone. Others welcomed him with warm smiles and familiar laughter. Daniel didn't share every detail. He just said, "I needed time away. I'm glad I took it." They accepted that. And those who didn't understand, he no longer felt the need to explain himself to them. He re-entered relationships differently now. He spoke more slowly. He listened more deeply. He no longer filled silences with unnecessary words. He was comfortable in stillness, even with others. And people noticed. Some said he seemed more peaceful. Others said he had changed in ways they couldn't describe. Daniel just smiled. He knew the change wasn't in his words or actions, it was in the space inside him. The way he now lived from presence rather than performance. One afternoon, while walking through the park near his old neighborhood, Daniel passed a bench where he used to sit during stressful days. He remembered how anxious he had felt back then, how he had often come there feeling restless, lost, unsure. He sat on that bench again now, but this time the world felt different. The trees still swayed, the children still played. The sun still fell through the leaves, but Daniel was no longer searching. He was home, not in a place, but in himself. He opened his notebook, which he had filled with months of thoughts from the village. As he flipped through the pages, he saw the progression: early doubts, slow realizations, honest questions, and quiet truths. He saw how his handwriting had softened over time, how the spaces between his words had widened. Even the way he wrote had become more open, more patient. He added one more entry at the end of the notebook. I thought I had to disappear to find something new, but I disappeared only to return to what was already here. Under the noise, beneath the roles, behind the fears. I've learned that we don't need to become someone else. We just need to become quiet enough to remember who we were before the world told us who we should be. That evening, Daniel sat by the window of his apartment watching the same city. Lights that once made him feel small. Now, they didn't intimidate him. He didn't feel the need to compete with them. He had seen a different kind of light, a quieter one. The kind that doesn't shine to be seen, but simply is. And he carried that light within him now. He still had challenges. He still had days when doubt returned, when the noise crept back in. But now he had tools. He had silence. He had awareness. He knew how to step back, how to listen, how to trust himself again. And that made all the difference. Daniel didn't speak of his journey often. He didn't tell people they needed to leave everything behind. He knew not everyone had the same path, but when someone told him they felt lost or disconnected, he listened carefully. And sometimes all he said was, "Try being quiet for a while. There's a version of you that you haven't met yet, and it lives in the silence." In time, Daniel became known as someone who brought a calm presence wherever he went. He didn't lead with charisma. He didn't try to impress. But people felt at ease around him. They felt seen, heard, respected, and it wasn't because he had all the answers, but because he had taken the time to sit with his own questions. He didn't live a big life. He lived a steady one rooted in clarity, one shaped by care, one defined not by noise but by depth. And in a world that often measures value by visibility, Daniel chose to live from invisibility, a kind of gentle strength that comes not from being noticed, but from being known to yourself. And so, the man who had once disappeared, not out of fear, but out of quiet need, did not come back with riches or fame. He came back with something greater, a life that belonged to him, and a self he could finally call home.